Marcos Miller. Marcos, take it
Okay,
away.
thank you so much, Joe. I'm Marcos Miller. I'm an educator and a member of GrowSmart's events committee and kind of a hobbyist when it comes to housing and transportation policy. I'm happy to be able to help host this event today and appreciate GrowSmart's support and this also the support of Kennebec Savings Bank, who's our sponsor today too. Um, Housing isn't just a hot topic, it is the topic on Mainers' minds. As the state wrestles with building housing of all kinds, work in the legislature to lower barriers to development continues, developers eye opportunities to meet demand, and communities are getting scrappy in an effort to close the gap. We're familiar with these headlines, but are you aware of the creative approaches that might be happening in your town? Alternative Housing Models is the first in the GrowSmart Maine webinar series, The House is Not Enough. Together, we'll hear from panelists about the alternative housing models that communities and organizations are pioneering around the state. I have three guests today who have a great deal of experience in this topic, Kate Hambley, Matt Peters, and Liz Trice. I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of them and then let them introduce themselves. Kate Hambley is a lawyer and self-described land use nerd who founded and runs Landform Law, which is a small law firm focused on land use and real estate development, and Landform Build, a design and development consultancy. Kate is also an aspiring developer and founder of Yard Sale, a platform where infill development buyers and sellers can meet and make deals happen. Matt Peters is a housing developer who is involved in the completion of over 20 new construction, major rehab, and acquisition deals. Matt worked for 8 years at Avesta Housing. In 2018, he began to consult for housing authorities, housing nonprofits, and community development finance institutions in Maine. Matt is also the executive director of Freeport Housing Trust based in Freeport, Maine. And Liz Trice has a background in public policy and facilitates visions, partnerships, and policies in the realm of housing, land use, conservation, and transportation. She's the founder and partner of Maine Cooperative Development Partners, which has over 200 middle income, mixed income, green homes under development in partnership with the City of Portland. Liz is also the policy and partnership director for Backyard ADUs, a 40-plus person design, build, construction company specializing in small net zero energy homes. Kate, I'd like to start with you. If you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and what makes you so passionate about this work. You're muted, Kate.
If you can read lips, I just said, oh, for Pete's sake. Sorry about that. So my origin story, I guess you could call it, if I were a villain, superhero or villain, is I grew up for the first part of my life in Deering Highlands and Deering Center, and then my parents moved me to Falmouth, and I hated it. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it at the time, but I was like, something about this town is worse. And it's not that, Falmouth is a very well-run town. I'm not, hating on Falmouth here. It's just that I feel that the best place to be a kid and now be a grown-up is where you can walk everywhere and live in a neighborhood environment where you have amenities and all of the facilities that come with relatively dense residential patterns. So that's really my core motivation. Layer on top of that the acute housing shortage, and I'd say my passion is figuring out how to get more people to live in those sort of missing middle, walkable communities, whether that's adding units to those communities or building more like them. And what we're trying to do, I'm kind of here mostly as a representative of Yard Sale. What we're trying to do in Yard Sale is to build more of that, usually through the infill development model.
Great, thanks. Matt Peters, what brings you to this work? And you're
I came to development work through the land use planning, actually, and through a sustainability lens. I feel like real estate development is the culmination of lots of public process and plans, and really the result of all of that work is what actually can get built, not just what we want to get built. And so I'm passionate about figuring out those financial problems as well as making sure that when we build well, we're building in places, again, a little bit what Kate was saying, that are walkable, that are near our neighbors, because that will help both our health, our sense of community, help reduce our vehicle miles traveled over the road, and help climate change. So all of that is what excites me, and housing specifically is a foundation of kind of where everything begins, and specifically affordable housing, and so that we have income to spend on other things, whether that's investing in ourselves, our kids, or taking care of others.
Thanks so much. And Liz, what makes you passionate about this work that you're doing?
Thank you. I think for me, it's about connecting people to each other and to nature. The more that our development patterns have been taken over by car infrastructure, the less we have access to even like our neighbors or anything around us outside our houses. Like Kate, I actually grew up in Nathan's Corner neighborhood in Portland, where she lives now, actually, well, so close to there anyway. And with lots of little capes, and we had a dead end street with lots of kids playing, which was kind of awesome. But it was also a little lonely, like there were no community spaces except for the street in the summertime. And when I went to college and started to travel, I just happened to land in a bunch of awesome, cute cities like Boulder, Colorado, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Annapolis, Maryland in succession, and a place in Costa Rica too that was also an awesome, small, walkable city. And then I landed in downtown Denver, which wasn't as cool in comparison. And I was like, what's going on here? And I had some interest in small spaces. I spent a lot of time like living in camp, like summer camps, and then in on sailboats, so I got into thinking about small things. And then I went to the Muskie School for a master's degree, and worked for a decade for the county government building new regional collaborations. So that's kind of the background. But for me, it's really about how do we create places where people can actually like enjoy their lives and live in harmony, both with other people and with nature.
Great. Thank you all. I'd like to start our discussion today with a brief overview of some of the alternative housing models that we're going to discuss. Joe, could you share that first slide, please? Matt, I'm going to direct the first question to you. What are some of the primary characteristics of cooperatively owned housing?
Cooperatively owned housing is it's similar to how maybe a condo is structured. You are together managing a property, whether that's the landscaping or the roof needs repair. Though it is different in that everybody doesn't necessarily have to have their own mortgage, and you actually own the building collectively. And so each of the residents is a member in a corporation that is the owner of the overall building. And then in Maine, we have the more specific option of a limited equity cooperative, which limits how much somebody can sell their share for. It also limits the affordability of how much that monthly cost can be in the cooperative, and that's a nice option for long-term affordability in a community.
And focusing specifically on the cooperatively owned housing, do we have any models of that we could look to in Maine or regionally?
We have two good models in Maine, and then I can talk regionally. The first is what's called the Rocks. It's resident-owned communities, and they're actually mobile home parks that have been purchased collectively by the residents. And so it's a cooperative that owns that mobile home park. And that really helps create stability. It's been in the paper a bunch because of a recent law that the legislature passed last year that gives mobile home parks some time to put together an offer to purchase the land. There's less than a dozen in Maine. There's very many more in New Hampshire. So that's a good place to look for people working together to manage their land collectively. The other example is in Lewiston. There's an organization called RaiseOp, which is a democratically managed housing cooperative, and they've been around for about 15 years, I believe. And so that's another local example. More broadly, regionally, co-ops are very prevalent in New York City. There's tens of thousands of units, both market rate co-ops as well as limited equity or restricted co-ops. And then the other nearest example is Washington, D.C. And I think some fun examples there is, as Washington, D.C. has been redeveloped, some of these cooperatives have been able to participate in that redevelopment. They'll sell their land or their building to a developer who will tear it down, and then they'll kind of participate in getting a new residence in whatever gets built.
Great, thanks. Liz, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just that I was at the Maine Principal 6 Co-op conference last weekend, and I was in a session on housing, and there were a couple of small co-ops, limited equity co-ops that exist, where it's like, 5 people bought a house together. So that exists too, and they're not necessarily being counted or tracked, but they exist.
Mhm.
Thank
Great,
you.
thank you. Yeah, and I do want us to talk a little more about that limited equity housing model in a minute. Kate, do you want to add anything else to cooperative housing, what you're seeing from your angle, or some other examples of it?
I was just going to say what Liz said. I mean, when we think legally speaking, a co-op usually refers to a certain statutory beast, and it's usually a type of corporation. But in essence, when you have a bunch of family members or friends form an LLC to buy a duplex or a triplex, it's basically the same thing, but with a different corporate entity with certain downsides, like it's harder to sell your shares in an LLC than it is to sell it in a corporation or co-op, but it's the same basic idea.
Great.
And those, I don't think those are like getting, press as like this cool, innovative thing, but it is innovative and it happens a lot.
Thank you. Joe, could you put the next slide on? I want us to take a closer look at the limited equity housing model that that we've started to wade into. Liz, can you tell us a little more about limited equity housing and maybe walk us through the chart we have here, which I'll thank you and Matt for putting together.
Yeah, I made this chart. So let's see. So the idea with limited equity co-op, if you see, it's got most in similar with a land trust condo, but let's compare it to a condo because I feel like that's just the comparison I want to make right now. So with a limited equity co-op, it might now remember these are ownership models, so they're different from the shape of the building. Anything could look more like apartment or look more like a single family house. Like that doesn't matter. This is ownership. But if you take the building the same, if you take a building that has 20 units in it and you compare a condo to a limited cooperative, the main difference is in a condo, you're going to have to, each individual person has to go to the bank and get a mortgage. So if anything about you doesn't look good to a bank, you're going to have trouble. In either place, you're going to have to put down some amount of money. In the condo, it's called a down payment to a bank, but in a limited equity cooperative, it's called a share because you're buying the share of the larger cooperative, which actually owns the housing. And so up front, you have this advantage with the co-op that you don't actually have to go to a bank to get a mortgage. And then what's different over time is with a condo, you have a leveraged investment, meaning that if you put 10% down as a down payment and then your housing doubles, even though 90% of that value is put in by the bank, you get to recoup when that number doubles. So you can, if you sell after 10 years and the value of your housing is doubled, you're walking away with more money. Whereas with a limited equity cooperative, you're just earning some appreciation on your initial share price, which is similar to a down payment. So you have stable housing costs, you have democratic governance, just like a condo. There's no landlord taking out profit, but when you walk away, you're just walking away with your initial investment plus a little bit of money. So hopefully over time, If you'd been renting, rents would have gone up, and they haven't. They've stayed stable. So over time, you've been able to save more money. And what it means is for the next household that moves in, they get to have something that is affordable to them. So that's why really it makes sense to do this when we have public money or philanthropic money to start new housing. It really makes sense to do it this. If you are just an individual person and you can get a mortgage and you found a condo you liked, like, you're going to make more money. You're going to build more wealth building a condo, but we're not helping to solve the housing problems of runaway housing values. So those are the major differences that I think I'd like to point out. And when we do, like what Matt and I are building at Doherty Commons, where it's a price restricted and income restricted condo, it's kind of in between, because we're essentially saying you can only move in here if you're below 100% of area median income. And when you sell, you get to only recoup a certain amount, because when you sell, it has to be to someone who's below 100% of area median income, and it has to be affordable to them. So you're going to get more profit, so to speak, when you sell that price restricted condo than you would if it was a limited equity co-op, but less than it was a market rate condo. And I could add like 3 more columns to this, but I you try to keep it within the realm.
Liz, yeah, can I follow up on something you just mentioned too? So you're saying that you could have a limited equity model, not just with co-op housing, but with single ownership housing too?
You could have a limited equity version that looked like individual houses. That's what I was saying. And then the other thing I was saying at the end was that between a market rate condo and a limited equity co-op is what we're doing at Doherty Commons, which is a price restricted and income restricted condo. So it means that the value of the condo grows every year, but you only get to capture as much as the local incomes are growing.
Thank you. Matt, where do we see some examples of limited equity housing in Maine or regionally?
Yeah, I think I answered this question in the last one. So the limited equity is the ROCs, the mobile home park cooperatives, and Raise Up, and the more market rate cooperatives. I don't know of too many or any really in Maine. I think there are some retirement communities that operate using a cooperative model, but I really haven't researched enough into that in Maine.
We don't
And
really
so we see market rate cooperatives a lot in New York and Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I mean, like Ocean View is essentially a
Yeah.
co-op. I mean, there's nothing like if you buy a unit in Ocean View in Falmouth, you're buying a share in the corporation of Ocean View with the rights to live in an Ocean View unit. I don't think there are any, like, if you think about all of this stuff as like there's sort of a conservation of value principle. Like a housing unit and the land it sits on is worth X amount, and that value has to go somewhere. So if you're going to cap the equity or cap the value in any way, there's usually like some philanthropic input to eat that wedge that's getting like lost, that's not getting captured in the market. And so like I feel like with Ocean View, even though it's a similar model, there's no philanthropy there. So I'm assuming the share price for Ocean View just like floats around with, whatever people are willing to pay.
Thanks. Liz, did you want to add something else too?
Yeah, just so except for what she was saying, we don't really have the market rate cooperative in the way that it's seen in New York. That's it.
Right. Joe, if you could show the third slide, there's one more lens I want to put over this too, and this is the idea of the community housing land trust, which I think we're bumping up against this already when we're talking about a philanthropic organization sort of taking the land ownership wedge out of the equation. Liz, can you tell us a little bit more about how a community housing land trust plays in with this?
Yeah, so and Matt can talk more about this too, but essentially with the land trust, often the land trust, a nonprofit organization owns the land under the housing. And then the housing could be a condo or something else, but And then the land trust usually puts permanent deed restrictions on the condos. So it's just another tool of how to do this. So it could in some cases it just could say that the land trust owns the land. And so and since the owner isn't owning the land, they're leasing it, that the appreciation is just on, let's say if the land value is 1/3 and the house is 2/3, then you're just earning appreciation on 2/3 of the value. But the land trust could also put a long-term deed restriction on the house to say, or condo to say how much it's allowed to appreciate. Matt, would you like to add to that? Because Matt actually runs a land trust.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that at a very high level, all of this stuff, and Kate mentioned this already, a lot of this stuff is malleable and can be tailored and adapted according to your overall high-arching goals, and then your subsequent limitations financially, locally, politically, residential, neighborhood-wise. And so I think what Liz was saying is there's a lot of different options, even with the land trust model. Just depends on your goals and how much you want to restrict or how much you don't want to restrict different things.
Thank you both, and we'll get into a little later some of the opportunities and some of the obstacles or barriers to these housing models. Kate, you've been really focusing through yard sale on ADUs and opportunities there. Could you tell us a little bit about your work and how this yard sale alternative ownership model might look like?
Sure. I don't know how alternative of an ownership model it is, but I guess I'll just say that like I think as I was mentioning with my sort of like conservation of value comment, that a lot of these models, like in our acute housing shortage and housing affordability crisis, the value of real estate is like a problem. It's not, it's like we are actually looking at an expensive single family home and thinking like, where do you stash some of that value somewhere other than the buyer to bring the price down to the buyer? And that's where the philanthropy or the subsidy comes in. Like for instance, you've got a single family home, stash the land with the land trust, and now the house costs less. Whereas like, and it, on the other hand, in yard sale, like I'm playing in the market rate, or we are trying to play in the market rate sandbox with no subsidy. So what we are trying to do is just add units to lots, like wherever we can. ADUs, additional principal dwelling units, it's all on the table with LD 2003. The goal is just like, okay, well, forget the subsidy part. Like if this house is single family home is too expensive, it's probably because there's too much land attached to it. Let's put another house on some of that land and split that value. And the ownership model for that is, in a perfect world, or a less regulated world, which I think is where we need to head to bring down, housing costs across the board. It would be easy to do that. If I own a house with extra space in my side yard where you could fit another house, like I would love to see towns throughout Maine just reduce minimum lot sizes, reduce frontage rules, reduce whatever, and make it easy for me to just hire a surveyor, split the lot, sell the land. That's not really the world we live in. And so instead, the state legislature has passed LD 2003. The lot stays the same size, but we now have the right to add units to the lot. And I think other developers are out there taking advantage of this situation and might buy a single family home and add a unit and then sell them as condos. What we are trying to do in yard sale is to have that happen faster and at scale and make it so that the house doesn't need to be listed on the open market yet and the person in that house doesn't need to move to make that possible. So like if, actually this is true. I live in a house with an extra, it's a historic double lot. There's space on my side yard. It's not splittable into its own lot because it's not quite wide enough. You could definitely fit a house there. Yard sale would come in and talk to me and say like, hey, can we turn your house, what looks like a single family, into a condo unit? And then we will purchase the right to build additional units in that space as additional rights under the condo declaration. And I think I made some slides to sort of illustrate this. I think this sort of model, it's not like we came up with this idea. The thing we're trying to do with yard sale is create like a replicable, scalable platform where this can all take place. But Joe, if you could show the slides that I put together just to kind of give people an idea. I think when we talk about condos, and Liz mentioned this too, I think for a lot of people, their brain immediately goes to a certain form factor for the structure, like either a tower and you own your unit, or they're like these semi-detached little doodads, little settlers of Catan houses over here. But if we could look at the next slide, condos don't have to be that. A condominium legally is just a situation where the ownership of a structure is severed from the ownership of the land underneath. So if you look at the image, actually in both of these images, the condo units are two individual structures that kind of look like single family homes. Technically on the left, that white one is a duplex, but the gray cedar one is a single family. And then on the right, that's my old house in Burlington and the condo behind it. This happened on that lot. So you'll take an existing single family, you'll say, okay, we're turning this into condo unit 1. We're going to sell off the right to build as condo unit 2, and then a new condo association will be formed. It will own the land underneath, and then in your condo declaration, you can kind of do whatever you want. You can try to recreate the experience of a single family home where each person has their own part of the lot, or you can say, no, we're going to have this common space. It's kind of all on the table. But yeah, I think so. This model isn't all that innovative. It happens. It's more about like, let's pick up the pace because there's plenty of buyer demand for the houses and plenty of seller demand to put a little money in their pocket. Like, let's have them meet.
Thank you, Kate. So if I'm a property owner and I've got a large yard and I was interested in doing this, what steps would I take to pursue this?
Well, we just launched our website like literally 10 minutes ago. It's purely informational at this point. And I don't even know the website name. So I'll drop it in the chat when my husband walks around the corner. He threw it up there. But basically, like, I think you could try to reach out to a developer who's done this in the past. I don't really know who they are except for the guy who did it. It's my Burlington house, or you can call us because we're getting inquiries from either side all the time. Ultimately, we want to turn yard sale into like a Zillow for this type of situation. So you could, we have standardized docs for the condo model, or maybe we have other model options as well, such as a ground lease or something like that. And you can list your property and people can come and buy it. Or, maybe we are the developer because we have a couple of these projects in the works ourselves.
So yard sale would help connect property owners with potential developers.
Yes. Yep. That's the goal. Or, I mean, it's still nascent at this point. What we're not 100% sure where we want to go is the developer doing the building under their own name every time? Or is every project a yard sale branded project with different money behind it every time, different investment or different, steering committee or whatever every time? Kind of headed towards that second model, especially because we would really like to layer in community financing, like crowdfunding as well. This is sort of a new world for me, but basically when you get into the world of real estate investment, if you're offering investment on a passive level, like the investor has no active role in the project. That is technically a security and it kicks you into a whole complicated web of securities regulation, but there's now an option to go through a lighter duty version of that through online crowdfunding. That's usually done as purely like profit maximization, like go invest in an apartment unit in Greenville, South Carolina, and good luck to you. But I would love to see it as more of a way of limiting the investor pool to people in the community, both as a way to like help them create wealth. If their development's going to happen in their community, like they should see a piece of that. But also I think it kind of changes the optics and dynamics around development. Instead of it being the big bad developer here to make money, it's like everyone can make money. And if you hopefully changes that knee-jerk NIMBYism response to seeing it in more positive light, and also as a signal for additional money that there's community support for projects.
Liz, I know you've done a lot of work with ADUs and backyard ADUs. What do you think about this model?
I think it's great. It's just like with anything else. It's just sort of a pain in the butt figuring out all the details and how to handle it and how to handle the legality of it and how to talk to banks and all of that. So I'm delighted that Kate's taking it on. So wearing my backyard ADUs hat, I'm the policy and partnerships director. And so looking at all different sorts of innovations. And a lot of our focus right now has been, we're really delighted that a lot of the zoning restrictions have gone away. And there's still some permitting restrictions like, like one town will require a separate sewer connection, and another town will require that you have to use the same sewer connection as the house, whereas really you just want to say what makes sense in this case and what saves money. And so sometimes there's barriers like that. And then a lot of our next focus has been on financing. So there's some federal laws that have changed in the last federal level laws that have changed in the last year that allow banks to offer better products that, for example, take into account the value and the income from the new ADUs. So that's great. So we're seeing great banks. Bangor Savings Bank is a great product. There's some other banks, Kennebunk. And for some homeowners, who already have pretty good income and home equity, they can just use home equity loans, which is great. And then we've been doing intensive research on how, if a municipality or other organization wants to incentivize ADUs, how they would deploy that money. And so we've been looking at programs in Vermont and California and all over, and I can talk for a long time about that, but I'll just say that those are like the basics we're looking at, and I'll drop in the chat a policy document that we've been working on.
Great, that's great. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other opportunities there. You did touch on municipalities, and Kate, back to you. What do you feel at this point municipalities need to know or understand, or what do you need from them to really make this take off?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would say this whole model that we have come up with is designed to work around a government created inefficiency. But I would really like municipalities to put us out of business, make our idea completely unnecessary, and just change the minimum lot size requirements or minimum frontage or whatever, because that's so much easier to just split the lot. And especially things like frontage, it's like, why? Why do we have this requirement? Legal access to your lot? Sure. Like, of course we need that. Can you fit an ambulance back there? I care about that. Why does it need to have 100 feet of frontage? Like, I think it's just been in the code for 100 years and no one's ever rethought it. So I think if municipalities wanted to see an increase in housing supply, before you start throwing money at the problem or before you start trying to subsidize our business model, I would say just like make it easier to turn spaces into lots, because that's how the real estate system is already set up, and it makes financing easier, makes ownership easier, makes everything easier. The second thing you could do, if you're not willing to do that, is to make it easier to sell ADUs separately. I think there's statewide legislation pending to address both of these issues. I don't know where it'll go or what's going to happen, but right now, it's decided at a town level whether ADUs are allowed to be sold separately. And just to be clear, like under LD 2003, you can build ADUs, you can also build additional principal units, which can be sold separately, but the ADUs generally have big pros, like they're not subject to density requirements. You can build ADUs in a lot of places. You can't build a PDU, but many towns say it has to be held in common ownership with the existing principal, so it can't be sold separately. And that's often a problem because it's pretty hard, for whatever reason, we're in a topsy-turvy real estate world, and you can make your money back with a sale where you can't with a rental, and it's killing a lot of pro formas. So I would do that, and I would think seriously about changing density rules too, because again, the PDU is a more attractive product and it's being held up by density. Density rules mean things like you need X square feet per dwelling unit, per principal dwelling unit. ADUs are exempt from that. Principal dwelling units aren't. So on my lot, for instance, with just shy of 15,000 feet, I could add one principal, but I couldn't add another because I don't have quite enough area to support those 3 units. That's no longer true under recode, but that's just like an example.
You did reference some legislation that's in the works, and this is maybe for Kate or for Liz. Are there some other things that the state can be doing to facilitate this work, and in general, how we're trying to sharpen this ADU axe that we've just been given?
So the bill that I think we're talking about is the removing barriers to building ADUs. And it's a little convoluted because it gets into subdivision law, but Kate at the most simple is correct. Like just reduce the minimum lot size. That's
Yeah, I
just,
think there's a have they been consolidated? Because the lot size one was 1274 and the ADU and whatever. They're going to end up all in one bill, I think. But
Mhm.
Okay, so it's in the works. We've already started talking about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities, and that's where I really want us to go to before we completely step into that room. In my conversations with you guys in preparation for this, we talked about some other alternative housing models, social housing, which is there's a task force that was just created in Portland, Maine to explore that. And Liz, I think you might have gone to a forum last month in Harvard about social housing. We also talked a little bit about employer housing and some municipal housing. Um, would any of you guys like to comment on those models and some opportunities or what you're seeing that might help us here in Maine?
Sure. I'll say something and then Matt can add on to it. But I did. So I went to the social housing forum at Harvard a couple weekends ago, and it was about New England. And it was interesting because there's, basically we're talking about public money in housing, right? And then what do you do with it? So we have historically public housing, which happens to be typically is for very low income people. We have all these programs that have put money into housing now. So when we say affordable housing, we often mean the low income housing tax credit program, which is for households that are 60% of very median income and below. And now what's being talked about when we talk about social housing, what we're often talking about is mixed income housing that has some public money infused at the beginning and then essentially assigns the people who are going to be managing the housing forever to say, look, you should have a mix of incomes in here and we don't want you to make a profit. So when times are good, it means you can drop rents and you can have some lower income people living in this housing. And when times are tough, you can tighten up a little bit, but we don't want it to require ongoing subsidy and we don't want it to be putting out a lot of profit. But of course, you can retain money, good practices for doing maintenance and things like that and upgrades. So, and there's in Montgomery County, Maryland has some great examples, and now there's other states that are jumping on, and there's a task force in Portland to talk about doing that. But it's also the idea of bonding. And like right now, Rockland, Maine is putting before voters a $10 million bond that they're not officially calling social housing, but they are talking about how do we put public money into housing and have it retained, have that value retained for a very, very long time. As opposed to, we're going to give subsidies to whoever's shopping for a home today, and then it's going to be gone tomorrow.
Mhm.
I'll stop there. Matt, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just say that like the city of Portland has had a housing trust fund where they've been able to make investments over the last several years to support housing development. And so I think it's just how you use those funds that are available, what you require in that negotiation, and what we're seeing sometimes, like in Montgomery County, is that municipal entities are taking a partial ownership stake. And so they're one of the equity partners in the property, and so they have certain maybe buyout rights, or maybe they receive dividends from the property. So that's one example of social housing. I think the other great examples, there's a New York Times article about what Vienna has done over the last 100 years. And so when you stretch out the time horizon from now to 30, 40, 100 years, you start to get into the situation where if the property is managed well, you end up paying off that initial mortgage, and you'll still have replacement costs, and you'll still have operating costs, and there'll be catastrophes, but but after 30 years, you don't have that mortgage anymore. And kind of somebody was saying it earlier, when each time an apartment building or a condo or a single family home sells, you're resetting that mortgage over and usually higher, right? So one person's appreciation is another person's unaffordable housing. And so when you switch the ownership model to, say, municipality or like Freeport Housing Trust, has been around for 35 years, you start to see those mortgage balances go down, or a limited equity housing cooperative is kind of along these similar lines as well, where that long-term equity that's built up in that real estate inures to the community rather than to individuals.
Kate, did you want to jump in on that at all?
Well, I had been kind of reflecting on the idea of using municipal bonds for real estate. And I think usually when the towns get involved in that way, or the state government or whatever level of government, they do it because they would expect to see some sort of regulated affordable housing component to it. But I think it's municipalities could get in the game and seriously help produce more housing, even just at market rate and even without government ownership of the property, because their interest rates on bonds are so much better than the developer can get from a bank. So like, but there are legal issues with that. Like, so if a municipality went and got a bond at 3.5%, whereas like market rate is 7%, and just turned that money straight over to a developer, and maybe they take an ownership stake, maybe they don't, maybe it's just another loan, like that would make a lot of projects pencil out. I realize there are like horrible optics to that, but like it would really move the needle on real estate development. Part of the problem with that is that usually there are state constitutional rules against the lending of credit. And maybe that would work. Maybe it would violate it. Maybe it wouldn't. But I think when you're on the lower end of the housing spectrum, there's definitely an argument that it's viable. So like, I think for the low, if a town's looking to get involved in some way in a really low risk, light touch, I don't want to be I don't want our little tiny town to become a property manager for 100 years. That's certainly one way to go about it.
Yeah. Just to put a pin in this, one thing I'm hearing from you guys is with the social housing model is basically taking the money. Let's use Portland, for example, their housing trust fund. And instead of granting it to a developer, oh, we like this project, we'll throw in $500,000 or something. Under the social housing model, they would take a share and then become a partial owner instead. Is that basically the gist of it?
I'd like to follow up with what Matt said. The real important thing is what are the long-term rules that the housing ownership is going to follow by? And maybe having an ownership gives you more leverage, but really you're saying we'll give you this money if you write into your legal agreements that forever you're going to govern the housing this way. That's really what you're trying to get at. And I know like the Vienna and the Montgomery thing is actually the housing taking ownership, the municipality taking ownership, but I'm not sure that that's 100% required to get the desired outcomes. There's also like what Kate was talking about, when you bond, you can get there's tax exempt and non-tax exempt bonding, and the tax exempt is usually a lower interest rate, but it usually requires the city to be a owner of the thing.
Oh, it does.
Whereas the non-tax exempt is a higher rate, though maybe not as high as market, and that has more flexibility. So that's something that municipalities have to figure out, the pros and cons of each.
Great, thank you. We've already bumped into, some of the obstacles, and the top of the list in every conversation I had with you guys and other folks that helped inform this webinar was financing, and whether it's just the cost of land, the cost of building, bank hesitancy. Matt, you talked about the risk premium and some of the work that you guys are doing and the models you're exploring. They're pretty innovative. There's not a strong track record of cooperative housing. There's not a lot of examples. If you could describe a little bit some of the challenges you're finding on the financing side and finding some financial support for these projects.
Sure. There's probably a couple different ones, so I'll try to go through some. So the first one you mentioned exactly is just the novelty, I guess I would say. There is not a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac style mortgage buyer for cooperative housing in the same kind of way that we have for single family and condominiums. So just that scale and that it's been going on for 70 years, that's a tried and true mortgage process. So people under banks and investors understand that risk when they are buying mortgages from single family homes. And then similarly, banks who are offering mortgages to an entity group that owns multifamily real estate that has a great track record that's been around for a while. Either that entity group is a very specific person that people can trust, or that 30-unit apartment building has also been done for hundreds of years. And so that financing is just a lot less risky, or maybe not less risky, but the risk is quantifiable. And so with a cooperative, the two risks are, you don't know who necessarily you're dealing with, right? Is the cooperative functioning well? Is it being operating under good governance? When we launched the food cooperative in Portland, that was one of the things that we focused a ton of energy on, going from a buying club to an actual store, because we took on a big mortgage and we had to make sure that the bank who was lending to us understood that we had good operating procedures. We knew how to work together, how to make decisions together, how to operate things together. So that was a challenge that you can overcome with some focus. So that's a risk. The other financing issue is specifically around just the capital stack, which means, so you get a mortgage, and typically when you're building an apartment building, you go get a bunch of investor financing who's going to own the building together. Now, if those investors are going to be members and owners of the cooperative, they might not be accredited investors with millions of dollars in the bank that are used to making these types of financial investments. And so that equity piece is missing. And so one of the challenges is, how do you fill that gap between the first mortgage from the bank, say, and the rest of the cost of building? Not to mention, we just aren't seeing a ton of new construction, even at the market rate. So so that's that's just a more systemic market challenge. But it just compounds the challenges that maybe a co-op would have getting started.
Liz, do you want to add anything to some of the financing challenges that you're aware of out there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I mean it's more of what Matt said, but essentially, the way that we were talking about big numbers, like millions of dollars, right? Or even if it's a couple $100,000 for an ADU, like banks are not in the habit of taking risks. So it's like they want everything collateralized. They want to know if they're loaning you $5 million, that you've got $5 million in the bank to cover it. It's not, so it's not how can we sort of democratize the creation of the basic human goods that we need is really important. So just like it's nice to know that you can grow a vegetable garden and that you don't have to get a tomato from South America flown to you. Would be nice to know that we can build the housing that we need to build. And that's part of why I like ADUs, because they're so much closer to what a normal human can produce and pay for. But I do wonder about how we can get away from how we can moderate the influences that banks have on building housing, because it's like they want to see that you have large contingencies, which is logical. They want to see collateral. It's all logical, but it would be nice to see more, I don't know, crowdfunding type things that, or neighbors or just normal professional people even being able to get together and build housing and have like moderate amounts of risk.
Yeah.
So I guess I think about that, democratizing, and like Build Maine and Carol Wilbur are really good about talking about how do we do small infill development and how can we train up, like the head of Maine Housing, I mean, or I don't know if it's exactly him, but people have said, like to solve our housing crisis, it's not just existing developers building more housing. It's actually like more developers, more types, more normal people building housing. So I'm really interested in that, like democratization
Yeah.
of building housing.
Well, I
Hey,
completely agree. And I just wanted to add too with, I mean, I think that the crowdfunding idea, the most practical initial application of it is like normally when you're building something, even a small single family home infill, like that cost these days to build a nice one, market rate, it could be easily $1 million, like no problem. So it's not a small sum of money. So you're talking about like that usually 80% of that's going to come from a bank, 20% is going to come from investors. And of that 20, just to start out with crowdfunding, it's probably realistic to expect no more than half of that to come from crowdfunding because it can be like lots of small amounts until it takes off. But I think it would be totally feasible to have someday the whole thing come from crowdfunding, all 1 million. And I think the flip side of that is like it's a nice way to build more housing, but it's also a nice way for those investors to build wealth. Because right now, under securities rules, you have like as a consumer protection rule to protect investors, the SEC requires you to be accredited, a term Matt mentioned, and the proxy for sophistication in that is wealth. How much wealth do you already have? Because it kind of measures your sophistication, but also your buffer. But what it basically means is that only rich people can have access to the high margins that real estate development can give you. It's high risk too, but it's like really high margins oftentimes. And so there is like on the national level, and I think it's coming from the Republican Party, as much as I hate to say it. Sorry for any Republicans on the call. Proposals to change the SEC rules for accreditation to have it be like a literal test. Like, do you know how real estate works and not be a wealth test? So I think that would be an important policy change. And the other thing is with real estate, in theory, you could avoid all of this by having everyone be local because then you're intrastate and the SEC has nothing to say about it. But then state securities law kicks in. So I think there should be state rule for crowdfunding. I mean, it's a very complicated world, but like there are the reason I think neighborhoods can't all just pitch into a pot and get a house built where there's a derelict rat trap right now is securities law. And that could change at the state level.
I just like to pick up on what she said about high margins. Right now, there are not high margins in real estate development, housing development, unless you're either building at the very high end or unless it's highly subsidized, which is part of why we don't have the housing we need right now.
Let's shift over to permitting barriers. You've touched on some of them with challenges with ADUs moving from town to town. Matt, maybe if we can start with you. What are you seeing for permitting barriers specifically to the types of housing that we've been talking about today?
I don't see necessarily too many permitting barriers other than time, usually. Sometimes it just takes a little bit longer than it feels like it should. And I think one of the biggest permitting barriers that I know Freeport's working on is just how many meetings do we need to have to review a development that is already meeting the existing zoning, that has already been approved and discussed by the local residents. Does there need to be lots and lots of additional public input? And I'm in favor of engagement and public advocacy is something that Liz and I have done a lot on with our developments in Portland, but not necessarily within many multiple monthly meetings where the board only meets once a month. I think that's my biggest challenge, is how do we compress the time between getting that idea and concept and getting under construction. So shrinking down the duration of the planning board review and approval process, as well as shrinking down that timeline of building permit review.
Kate, I saw you nodding your head. Do you want to add on to some other permitting issues that you see?
Well, I mean, I agree. It's just too slow. But the reason is like you have to have a planning board meet at a public meeting. It would be illegal not to. And they're volunteers often. And it's they can't just call a special meeting whenever you need to. So I think the solution is send fewer things to the planning board. I mean, it's all a municipality's decision what level of development triggers planning board review versus just staff level review. But bigger picture, drum I've been beating for a while is I'm a land use lawyer. I do a lot of appeals. The appeals process in Maine, that's a problem because even if you get through permitting, if a neighbor appeals, you're probably done. Because it could take literally years to get a decision from the court, even if the appeal is frivolous. I mean, it varies a lot county to county, but the courts are just so backlogged. There's no fast track. It's hugely problematic. And then to Matt's point about the planning board schedule, like out in Washington, where I used to be a land use lawyer, in the 90s, they switched from the conventional planning board zoning board setup to enact a statute that allowed towns optionally to instead set up a hearing examiner system. The hearing examiner is like a municipal judge, usually a land use attorney hired by the town or the city, and they will review subdivisions. Like they can take most of the actions that a planning board or even a town council can, but they just schedule their hearings whenever they're free during the working day because that's their job and it costs money. But the other thing is like usually a zoning board or planning board, even though they I'm not trashing them, they generously devote their evenings to this. They're often not land use professionals or at least not lawyers, and they don't really know how to build a record all the time that can withstand appeal. So even if they're right in approving a permit, they got it right. If they don't show their work, it's going to get remanded and add years to the whole process. So I think switching to a hearing examiner system with a dedicated arm of the Superior Court for fast track land use appeals would fix a lot of these problems.
Thanks. Liz, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to back up and just say the problem with like the planning board process is just it is that we should be allowing things by right. Like it takes effort for towns to figure out where they actually want housing and what kind of housing they want. But theoretically, if they said we will allow 3-story housing here and we don't care what it looks like, or it has to have a peaked roof, or we need, 1 parking space, and that's it. It could be fairly simple, and it could just be a staff. Did you check all the boxes? Done. But there's 2 problems. One is, really the bigger problem is it a political process? Because if you're told that you have to spend $200,000 coming up with a plan before the city will tell you yes or no, and then you're going in front of a group of people who are essentially not checking boxes and following the rules, but are saying, I like this, or I don't like this, or someone I know who lives next door doesn't want this, then that's like a political thing, which is really problematic, because really you want to know as a developer before you buy the land and before you spend money on a civil engineer and an architect, what you're going to be allowed to build, so that that's what you design. And this gets back to the democratization of things, because like there's only so many people out there who can afford to spend that $200,000 and lose it occasionally, So the more that towns are able to be very concrete about what they're going to allow and say, if you build what we say we're going to allow, we'll make it really easy for you. Like you don't actually have to take that risk. Then the more people are going to be able to get into that game and actually build what a town wants to see.
But part of that problem is I think it's state subdivision law, like because if you build 3 units, you're in subdivision land. And so it's not so much a matter of is it of right or is it a conditional use? It's like it's going to the planning board if it's a subdivision and gets bogged down. And I think there are proposals to change the subdivision thresholds. I don't think that it should be changed in terms of number of lots. I actually think it should be a subdivision if it's even 2 lots, let alone 3. But in terms of housing units, like why would housing units trigger subdivision review? You know, like that. So I think I completely agree with everything you're saying. And just noting that a lot of stuff gets shuttled to planning board simply because of that statewide subdivision threshold that really ought
So
to change.
ideally, we would say, you know, if town, whether it's at the state or the local level, we would be able to say, we want infill developments of up to 10 units to be really easily stamped as long as they fit these criteria, and then you would get them.
Or just, yeah, I think it's pretty Maine's the only state I've ever seen that triggers subdivision review by number of housing units, because theoretically a subdivision is splitting land. Like that's how it is in literally every other state. And by that same token, I've also never seen a state where subdivision starts at 3, because now when you split a lot into 2, no one at the municipality reviews that, which I think developers kind of like, but they don't realize it's kicking them in the butt when they do it wrong, and then they've got a lawsuit from the buyer, and it's just a mess. So I would love to see subdivision reform, maybe not this session, but in a thoughtful way next session.
Great.
And I will say that there has been talk at the state level around developing building designs that if you use the suite of building designs that are already selected and approved by the state and then maybe adopted by the town, that the building permit process, maybe not the planning approval, that's different from a site plan thing, but the building permit process is much more, I'll say, rubber stamped, because you're using the drawings that are previously approved as meeting the building code. And I think that's a good pathway. It's not fully adopted yet, but I know that there's a bunch of different people at the state level discussing that.
Great. Before we dive deeper into the opportunities, are there any other barriers that you guys want to just throw out there real quick for the audience that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I would just say, I think when we talked about financing, we maybe weren't that clear about differentiating between the 2 phases of financing for a project. There's initial financing to get the thing built, and then oftentimes like the investors hold on to it, so then it's the end. But if you're trying to build and sell, then there's takeout financing, meaning the financing for the ultimate people who are going to live in it. And like even my relatively simple, not all that innovative model of adding condos, it's complicated on the takeout end because Fannie and Freddie's rules for warrantying condos are meant to protect people from the timeshare scandals of the 80s. And so they have things like it's not warrantable if there are fewer than 10 units or one person owns more than 50%. So it's not you can still get a loan for a condo. There are, the west end of Portland or most of Portland is covered in 3-unit condos, but they are not warranted. So they are going to cost more. And that just adds money to the cost of everything. So I guess I would just say like the financing. It's easy to pick on planning boards and permitting, but the financing is the thing that shapes the price of everything.
Yeah, and Marcos, I'll also add about financing. So again, the trodden pathways are easier, right? And so that's why we're talking about alternatives. We have, when we initially wanted to explore developing cooperatives and having conversations with Maine Housing, a lot of their programs weren't quite compatible with the specific identity of a limited equity housing cooperative. Similarly, the land trust model has had a challenging time trying to figure out how to access state funding. I just wanted to flag that, and I know that there are a lot of different conversations about how to do it, and there are ways to kind of Raise Up was successful in building a low-income housing tax credit property. It's not really exactly a cooperative, but it's it's in the vein and will be run with that mindset. But I just wanted to flag it that's a challenge that a lot of these alternative models do have a hard time accessing existing programs.
Yeah, I believe the current Maine housing condo program that we talked about before, the affordable housing home ownership program, is not giving money where the land trust owns the land underneath, which is like, would be an easy, seems like it would be an easy thing to allow, but it's not
Yeah.
there yet.
Does anyone know, actually, sorry, this maybe might be considered regulatory, but for the community housing land trust, I've often thought like, oh, well, if I owned a market rate 3 unit in Portland and I'm getting out of the real estate game and I just want to live on my boat or whatever, and I wanted to sell it as 3 condos and donate the land to a land trust so I can, and then write that donation off to offset my capital gains. Like that would be a really good way of keeping the cost of the 3 down. I can sell them for less and still make money, but I don't know if the IRS treats that as a charitable donation. Does anyone know?
My understanding is that when you donate things to a 501c3,
It ought to count.
it's a charitable donation, but I also know that it's not as easy as maybe it used to be with limits around what you can claim and how everybody's tax situation is different too.
Yeah.
I love that idea, Kate, and I think we should look into it because it'd be great to, there is a Greater Portland Community Land Trust that's dormant right now. They don't own any properties. And something like that, especially if there were tax benefits, might be able to help
Yeah.
trust in Portland really get going.
Because I think land trusts come at it with the idea that they're going to build housing, but their most important feature is basically just be like a holding company for land to get that land out of the value of the housing, which is the thing that keeps people warm and dry. So I think that's a lot simpler.
Liz, you had mentioned this idea about a slow housing investor group. Can you tell us a little bit about that since we're on financing opportunities?
Yes, I think what I was talking about was just this idea of having lower interest money available for housing. So one of the challenging things about developing new housing is that you are um, completely at the whim of the changing interest rate environment. And so if it takes 5 years to build housing, it's really hard. Like with our some of our projects in Portland, we started them when interest rates were 3% and then it went to 8%. And that's the difference between having some profit and being several $1,000,000 in the hole on a big project. So one thing that would be very helpful is having steady money that could be 4 or 5%. So what people think are decent in terms of, a bond or a CD or something like that. And to know that it's going to be there, because part of what adds risk and hence cost to the cost of doing housing development is not knowing and panicking when the interest rates are going up and down and trying to have accommodate for those increases. And so, um, the idea that there might be investors who want to see housing or certain types of housing exist to say, sure, I'll put up, $500,000, $1,000,000, $2,000,000 at 4 or 5% is a game changer for people trying to build affordable and moderate income housing. And it's also part of the goal of the whole social housing idea, or towns bonding for housing, is to say, can a town bond at 3% and then loan it out at 5% and have it not be quite as like right now with the state programs, they're competitive, meaning that there's more people asking for the money than there is housing, than there is money. So, like with the most recent rounds of funding, you might have 20 projects that have spent all that money and all that time developing the plans for the projects to apply for the money, and then only half of them get funded. So that means you have half of the developers who now have to pay the costs of spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars on pre-development. Maybe they've acquired the land. So now they have all of these expenses and they're wondering if the program's going to have an allocation again in 2 years. So having more money that's available at that 4 or 5% level, or even sometimes 6%, that you just can rely on, would change the whole game and make it way less risky. And maybe those risks are tolerable if you think you're going to make, a huge profit, but if you're not, it's really challenging.
Yeah. Let's just take all the neighborhood associations, turn them into REITs, and have everyone invest their money. That's the other way, the old-fashioned way of crowdfunding. Let's just
What
do
would
it.
a REIT be, Kate?
REIT is a real estate investment trust, and it's still technically like owning a stake in a REIT, I think would still be a security. So the thing with securities laws, it's all about like, who can you publicly advertise this thing to? Because if you're just like, if I'm throwing it up on the internet, like, hey, give me your money, then I should really be doing an IPO. But if you're a neighborhood association, everyone knows each other already. I think that's probably not a general solicitation, and it's a little bit easier to get around the accredited investor rules and all that sort of thing. And I think the other nice thing about a REIT is that if you think about crowdfunding platforms, a lot of them are designed to be one-to-one. So it's like your potential crowdfunding investor. Do you like this project? Do you think it's a good idea? Invest your money in this project. But like most people probably aren't comfortable with that level of like having all their eggs in one basket. Whereas if you invest in a REIT, they have 6 projects going on, or 106, or, depending on the size of it. But if, it's on my to-do list to call the Deering Center Neighbor Association and be like, let's get this cooking. I want another bar downtown, in our little downtown. Let's make it happen.
So something that's similar to that, Kate, is they're calling it a mint, but it's essentially the neighborhood trust or the key Googleable words.
Oh,
So
yeah, neighborhood investment
Yeah.
all that stuff.
So
Yeah.
it's basically an organization starts buying up properties in a given neighborhood. And it can be businesses, it can be rental housing, it can be lower income housing, it can be higher income housing, but you just buy it all up and then you manage it as a portfolio and you have a mission. Your mission
Yeah.
is a vibrant neighborhood with a mix of affordable housing types. And so, but point being, you just start acquiring stuff with that goal. And then over time, you might be like, oh, we want to reduce the rents on some of these, or we want to increase the rents, or we want to sell this and buy this. But it's just a local, geographically local, mission-based real estate investment thing.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful idea, because it's like you were saying, it's like, it's not a charity. Like the money invested makes money. It just doesn't have to make as much money, and you get better stuff in your community because of it,
Friends, thanks so much. I have one more question I wanted to throw out to you, and then we've got a bunch of questions in the queue too. But this has been a great conversation. One thing that I know you referenced earlier, some of you did in the conversation, and that we talked about also, was some limitations that there are with Maine housing, what their ability to fund. What are some I think somebody mentioned that, and actually this is probably even in something we didn't even get to, but I do want to reference it. The Department of Economic and Community Development recently released their roadmap for future of housing production in Maine. How can the state, particularly Maine Housing, be more supportive of innovative housing projects?
Money.
Yeah, it's basically what Matt said. It's like make sure that 10% of all future bonds just say for innovative housing models, that support the goals of permanently affordable housing. That's it. Just like create a fund for pilots and new models. You can go specifically and you can say for co-ops or land trusts or whatever, but just like saying innovation generally would really help, because otherwise all the money goes into the existing pots and nothing new gets funded.
Yeah.
And then they don't get credibility, but they would have credibility if they have money. That's
Right.
the thing, right?
Yeah, the vicious cycle that doesn't turn. Joe, do you have some, it looks like there's a lot in the chat. Have you gleaned a couple questions for our panelists?
Howdy. Yeah, I have. And unfortunately, it looks like Carolyn, who had a question that she wanted to hop on mic for, is no longer here. But I'll do my best to circle up with her after the fact. So in light of that, we'll go next in the chat to Tanya, who is interested in the presenter's thoughts about the constant tension between MUBEC and local control. I think local control is a thing that we touched on a couple different times in different ways, but I'm also curious about this. And how do we get consistency in appropriate regulation from place to place, but also allow for local control? Statewide zoning is almost always opposed by municipal interest groups, even if it would further their housing goals. I don't know if anybody wants to answer
Yeah,
that.
I can start with it and then we can see where it goes. I think local control is important. We already talked a lot about democracy and choice and decision making and process and wanting to understand what your community looks like. I think then even if people do want X, like they would prefer an extra restaurant option downtown, or they would like their local elementary school not to shut down because there's not enough housing within a walkable area. Um, it's also then hard to also see change of what wouldn't be necessary in order to achieve those goals. Um, and so I think local control also is hard too when we have statewide housing challenges or even whatever the challenge may be. Um, I think it goes hand in hand with local responsibility as well. And so if the state is having a housing challenge, we kind of all need to chip in together and work together regardless of what municipality we are. Um, I think MUBEC and local control is interesting. I think there is a lot of benefit of having as much standardized building type things as possible across our state. Um, and that local control can happen more as a Congress, right? When we all work together at a state level to come to a compromise, you know. And maybe those compromises then get ugly and messy, but at least it's consistent so that when a small developer who doesn't have a lot of capacity likes to work in one town decides that uh, their sister found a great deal for something in another town that's just next door that has totally different rules, there isn't learning curve and expense there as well. The same with just not the developer, but builders. You know, if the builder knows how to do it in one town, or the plumber knows that this is what happens across the entire state and doesn't have to read code because they like to do the building. I think that's really helpful.
But
So I
I
think there's
guess,
ways to get at local control, but not. Um, I think consistency is helpful. I guess that's my point.
Kate?
well, I agree with that. I would just say I represent a lot of people in my legal practice in relatively small towns and rural areas who fall into this trap because MUBEC is not, towns under 4,000 are not required to enforce MUBEC. And it's a huge sprawl generator because, like, obviously, if you don't, especially with the recent changes to MUBEC in April of now requiring the stretch code, like way more energy efficiency rules, it is way cheaper to build in a small town because they don't enforce MUBEC. And in theory, the building is still subject to MUBEC, but there's no obligation to enforce it. And it's not like I understand why that rule is there. Like small towns struggle financially, they don't have the staff, but like that is not a good policy to make it cheaper to build in a rural area.
Kate,
Yeah.
could you just explain what MUBEC is for some in our audience who aren't up on all the acronyms?
Of course, MUBEC is the Maine Uniform Building and Energy Code. It's the building code, and it's the same statewide, except that it's not enforced everywhere. And I think like you could have, if the issue is municipal funds to enforce it, you could have an easy fix of basically making the builder liable for a violation of that, liable to the person who ultimately buys the house, make it a private matter between parties. But yeah, I think there is a lot of virtue to having it be standardized. I just think that I think people who push local control don't understand that a lot of towns do not enforce their ordinances. Like not just MUBEC. I'm talking shoreline zoning, I'm talking all this stuff. And it's just from lack of resources, or sometimes it's just that's kind of how it's always been. And when that happens, it affects people who are building, usually like custom homes. They are like, well, the code enforcement officer stamped it, I should be fine. And they're like, nope, doesn't, like it totally violate, it causes these traps for people who are like, well, my neighbor did this and it wasn't a problem. Like, and they're like, well, we're enforcing it against you. I just have this I think local control is good in theory, but I think municipalities can get over their skis sometimes, enforce more regulations, or excuse me, pass more regulations than they can afford to enforce. And that gap between what's on the books and what actually gets enforced is a trap for people to fall into, because the town then has the right to just kind of be like, gotcha, to whoever they can afford to do that to at the time.
Thank you, Kate. Liz.
Yeah, I haven't spent enough time in Augusta to understand what it takes to get something that overrules local control. Like LD 2003 is really amazing, right? And then some other things seem like as soon as it touches local control, it's deal breaker. But I would be inclined to say to provide towns more support, say like, hey, here's a regional program that will enforce short-term rentals for you. Hey, here's a regional program where here's 3 different housing programs that we know work for housing production, something like rural rentals, something like affordable home ownership, and something like an ADU support program. And we'll manage it for you, or we'll give you money for you, or if you create your plan, we'll support you to help create the plan, and then we'll put money into it for you.
I
So you're
completely agree.
providing
Yeah.
financial incentives and technical support for towns to create what they want. And you can say, it has to be in a growth area. We'll give you money for sewer. You know what it is, like giving the money for what the state wants and then encouraging and supporting it. And I don't really see that, honestly. It seems like towns are often left on their own to try to figure it out, and you often don't have great results.
Yeah, I think a lot of the hostility from municipalities to statewide legislation, they might be arguing that phrase local control, but what it's coming from is like, we're barely afloat. We have one part-time staff member. Like, we cannot enforce this new thing. And I think they have a good point that a lot of the statewide stuff ends up being an unfunded mandate. So yeah, I completely agree.
Joe, do we have any more questions in the chat?
Yeah, we do. We have Peter's question, in which he asks, are you going to discuss the Maine Housing Authority grants program and the use of covenants to maintain affordability? Most affordable housing being built today uses these approaches.
Did talk about that a little bit. That was 45 minutes ago, so I'm curious if Peter has like specific questions.
Peter, if you've got want to put anything in the chat about that, Kate or Matt, do you want to speak to that at all at this point?
I'd just say that, yeah, Maine Housing does a great job producing funding housing that has long-term affordability covenants. And then I guess it's not what the 2 programs that they do support pretty heavily, the low-income housing tax credit program, and then they also have their they buy mortgages for single-family homes as well, that helps keep the interest rate lower. They have a lot of other programs. I mean, they're a very large organization that does a lot of different things too. So
Thanks. I think I might have time for one more question. Before people leave, I do want our audience to know that we do have a feedback form in the chat. We really appreciate your feedback, what you think about this forum, the topic, what you'd like to learn more about, and how else we could dig into the issues of housing in our future The House Is Not Enough webinars. Joe, do you have any final question to top this off with?
Yeah, there was another question from Tanya that seemed like it was kind of in context of the conversation, what, 40 minutes ago, and it had to do with TIF proceeds. And I'm curious if she's still here and wants to hop on mic and
There she is.
in context. Yeah.
I am, Joe, and if it's it was when we were talking about municipal bonds. Most communities are so reluctant to bond that I'm just wondering if TIF proceeds are an option. Is that something that should be more widely promoted and taught and encouraged as a way to bankroll some of that municipal investment?
yeah, I only know about this tangentially. So Kate, I don't know if you have a little bit more. But in Freeport,
I feel like I should. Oh, sorry. I feel like I should know the answer, but I don't. I really
yeah,
just
okay.
don't. You
So
take this one.
in Freeport, I've been a part of conversations around updating our kind of downtown corridor municipal TIF area so that it's a I think it's a transit-oriented development TIF district, and so there's some new TIF legislation that has just passed, and maybe this is a forum for another time, but that it does open up those TIF funds to be used to support housing more broadly, affordable housing more broadly, in much more flexible way than previous iterations of TIF districts. Right now, affordable housing TIF districts is another type of TIF than the kind of the transportation oriented development TIF, and overseen by Maine Housing, and they're very project specific TIFs. They have to, and so towns and municipalities already use those, I think, pretty well, but they are very project specific, and I think there's going to be some new flexibility as TIFs, existing TIFs are redone and create some larger pools of money potentially to fund projects in a little bit different ways. Yeah.
I will say TIFs are super helpful to developments because basically, if I know that we're going to get back, that the project is going to get back, say 50% of the tax money, like that's going to provide an extra, let's say $20,000 a year for 30 years, you can literally walk to the bank with that. It's called a credit enhancement agreement, and the bank will loan you more money. So that's a very helpful tool in the toolbox.
All right. I want to thank Liz, Kate, and Matt for your participation. I want to thank everybody in the audience. Joe, thanks for working behind the scenes to make this all happen. GrowSmart Maine will be holding future webinars on housing. This is just the first in our The House is Not Enough series. So we appreciate your feedback in the link on the chat about this webinar and future webinars and what else you'd like to learn about. Thank you all once again and have a great evening.